A few months ago, I read Whitebird by R.J. Palacio, and it is such a powerful story. It's a graphic novel, and it's the story of a Jewish child in France hidden by a non-Jewish family during World War II. I highly recommend it for anyone interested in knowing more about the Holocaust or is looking for a book to help future generations understand what happened so that it may never happen again. It's a story about friendship. It's a story about regrets. It's a story about courage. It's a story about standing up against injustice. It's about dreaming about a better future and doing something about it. While I was speaking to my guest today, the story popped into my head. My guest describes the shift in how leaders can lead. He talks about the current landscape and how, by working closely with others, and by the way, I was so struck by how often he talked about his colleagues by name. By working with others, that great things can happen. My guest is Dr. Max Silverman. He talks about shifting an entire system. And I don't mean just like one school district. I mean the entire educational system of our nation. Transforming it, really. Thanks for tuning in. Today on An Imperfect Leader, Max Silverman is my guest. Max is the Executive Director of the University of Washington's Center for Educational Leadership, or CEL, where he provides leadership for improving school systems focused on equitable outcomes for students. Throughout his career, Max has served in a variety of leadership positions, including classroom teacher, school principal, director, district leader, and most recently as Deputy Director of CEL and now the Director. He is known and respected locally and nationally, and I'm thrilled to have him as my guest. Max, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thanks, Peter. I'm really excited to be here with you.
Max, for those who are not familiar with the Center for Educational Leadership, or CEL, I know I can say that you lead national projects to implement new systems to improve leadership effectiveness, and that happens with individual school districts who want to improve leadership performances at scale. You do this at the school level with supporting the growth of principals and their teacher leader teams, and you do this at the district level, supporting superintendents and their teams. And as I've gotten to become more familiar with the way that CEL supports schools and school districts, I've learned a great deal about the different frameworks that you use to support leadership. Would you tell us about the frameworks and, an example of how you use them to fuel continuous development?
Yeah, Peter, I have to say, I really appreciate, since we first met, how you've just tuned into and attuned to what we're trying to do with our frameworks, because I think there's a real power to them, and I just appreciate how you've dug into them. So, we've learned that what we call frameworks are really great tools for leaders to both individually and system-wide reflect and learn. And so our frameworks were designed with some guiding principles. And then, the first thing that we thought of was something that I heard from Bob Lenz from the Buck Institute, who taught me that simple tools lead to complex thinking, and complex tools lead to simple thinking. And so I hope you noticed in our framework, they're simple but not simplistic. And they're also designed to both create aspirational views, as well as use inquiry questions to make either individuals or a whole system really reflect on where they're at in relation to what practice can be.
Yeah, so for those who are listening, and I will put a link to CEL's website because you offer those frameworks for leaders and the public for their perusal. And what I really have always appreciated about them as I've gotten to read them more thoroughly is exactly that. They are reflective questions that allow for that collective aspiration to sort of guide how we want to be together as an organization, as well as how I want to be individually as a leader. And you're right, they aren't complicated questions, but they really do get to the heart of what one might be trying to achieve for their district, a different way of leading.
Yes. And there was more to your question that I think I didn't get to.
Well, so tell us more about the frameworks. And my apologies for interrupting, but you have two different frameworks, one for principals, one for leaders, although they are very complementary, but they do speak to the different roles that individuals play within their organizations.
Yeah, it's funny. We actually now are up to 4 frameworks, and it starts with our teaching and learning framework, which we call the 5 dimensions of teaching and learning. We also have one for school leadership. We also designed one to help school leaders understand how to lead for teacher learning. And then the fourth one, the central office one, around supporting principals as leaders for equity. And as you know, and people will see as they grab them, they're really centered in practice. So it helps somebody think about what it is they're doing day in and day out in their work. And it's been kind of fun. If you want, I could tell you maybe like a quick story of one of the frameworks
I would
in
love
action. Yeah. So I work a lot with our principal support framework. And it basically, to some degree, answers the question, what do central office leaders do if they're really supporting principals as leaders of equity for their school? Very different than when it first was written to how do you help principals be instructional leaders. We have a much broader take. And, it's designed around a few central things that we learned from talking with principals and system leaders. So one, we learned school systems have minimal clarity on the role of principals. If we say, what's the principal's job, they might give us like a framework, or their evaluation tool. But when we ask
right, or the job description, which is just a laundry list of tasks with the last bullet saying, and other duties as assigned.
We have this it's a pretty funny survey that we do of central office managers. And the first question is, what's the role of principal in your system? And the options are instructional leader, building manager, CEO, or based on what they're good at. Only 2 school systems that we've done this with have gotten over 50% agreement. And what that means for a principal then is, for the business manager, oh, I'm a CEO. For the facilities folks, I'm a building manager. For the teaching and learning folks, I'm an instructional leader. And so everybody treats me as this different role. So the framework helps with that. But we also learned that principals, school systems don't have any systems of professional learning for principals. They might, if they're lucky, have a good supervisor who's a good coach. They might, if they're lucky, bring in a good PD provider every now and then. But there's no thoughtful way around our principals are our key leaders. How do we help them develop and grow? What does their work look like individually? How do they learn together? What are our systems of learning? So it addresses that. And it also addresses this idea that principals most typically experience the rest of the central office as reactive and top-down. They are sort of an implementer of 10 or 15 different people's wonderful initiatives.
Yes, and often impulsive implementers, right? They see a one sort of episodic issue, and then they sort of generalize everyone must be struggling with this, and then impulsively assign a new initiative, right?
Definitely. Yes, they're sort of, I know in school systems they think they're being smart when each department just has one initiative, but at that bottom of that funnel is the principal, who is still grappling with 8 to 12 initiatives. And our latest version, Peter, and I think you'll appreciate this, is really cool, is we also learned from principals that they're being asked to lead for equity. That's the new mandate on them, and most of them want to do that, but they don't work in school systems where the central office models what inclusive and equity-centered leadership looks like day to day in practice. So, those are our four dimensions, right? Like inclusive and equity-centered leadership at the central office, role clarity for the principal, systems of professional learning, and a school district central office that's proactive in supporting schools and principals. When it's in play, we haven't gotten anybody to get all the way through the framework yet, but we have had people really work on role clarity and do that with principals, and that's a help. And then that tees up to professional learning. And then we've had a lot of fun using design thinking to help different departments in the central office be more proactive in their approach. So it's been fun to see districts who take this on more seriously really grapple with, because of the framework, what's not in place for principals. And then the first thing they ask is, oh, who can we go see that does this well? And we say, there's nobody. You have to figure this out in your context. And then to watch them really take it on has been a lot of fun.
I think that's so important. I've talked to some superintendents around the nation who have indicated those visits to other districts are important, and at the same time to recognize that your context and your situation is different. And so how do you take good learning and good practices, but also consider how it might apply in your own community? In the leadership model that I've used to advise others, there's a dimension, collective aspiration. And that's the heart of an organization's work. And it speaks to Peter Senge's two big questions. What do we want to create together? And how do we want to be together? And inside that dimension is a term that actually comes from another educational leader, an instructional leader, Ron Berger. And that term is an ethic of excellence, and not ethics, but an ethic, an ethos. And when I read about Sell's 5 dimensions of teaching and learning, an ethic of excellence just jumped right out to me. Giving children authentic experiences to learn, valuing their voice and their identities, encouraging productive struggle, setting goals, and documenting progress. I mean, these are traits that Ron Berger writes about, and these are definitely important to Sell.
Yeah, I was a former client of Sell's when I was a new high school principal. And, one of Sell's mantras back then is you can't lead what you don't know. And the one thing that's clear across the country, and we have some pretty good research to back this up, is most people charged with leading schools or districts don't have the ability to get into a classroom or school and even come up with a hypothesis around what's the teaching and what learning is that causing and for which students. Or even worse, what learning isn't happening and for which students and why. And so from its start, Sell has just always believed that the only place you can really develop leadership expertise and practice is in the presence of students and their learning. So we start all of our work from, Richard Elmore's instructional core. And we actually developed the framework because of that. 20 years ago, walkthroughs used to look like something like 8 to 10 leaders, get in a room and decide they're going to do a walkthrough. And they say like, oh, we want to look at student engagement. And then they'll say, oh, what does student engagement look like? And they'll just off the top of their head make, from their best knowledge, talk about what it looks like. And imagine like rounds in a hospital. I know Dick Elmore uses that example too. Like if doctors didn't have an understanding together and a calibration around anatomy, them going in and looking at a patient and sort of trying to figure out what's going on with this patient. Well, they don't have to make stuff up, right? They actually understand human anatomy and systems and have a way of thinking. So we built the framework to help leaders see so that when they are in classrooms together to develop hypotheses around what's causing learning or not, they now have an anatomy of instruction. So all of our learning with leaders, everything we try to do, then we do in classrooms. So that if they're trying to fix a system, it starts with what problems of student learning are you actually trying to solve? And oftentimes, I'll just share real quick, we see superintendents often like, I have a great example from the Yakima Valley School District, 3rd grade, math scores were low for their English language learning students. And these were middle school students, pardon me. And the superintendent immediately wanted to figure out what's on the marketplace that I can buy that's targeted at, English language learners and math. So what we decided was, well, let's go see these kids in class. And what we noticed pretty quickly was their computational skills were really good. They could actually do the math, but their ability to write responses is where they were really struggling. So what's going on here? And it ended up that the district had invested heavily. This was back in the day in SIOP. And so really they had made investments in teacher, being able to use English language targets and meet the needs of English language learners in the content. And yet we saw none of that. So we just before you spend a couple $100,000 and plugging kids on a computer, what are some things that might be causing, because they can do the math, so they don't need to be on a remedial program. So the frameworks help 2 things, the calibration and then alongside habits of thinking, really allow leaders to then take that qualitative data and make better, choices around actions they want to take to change the equation around who's learning in their classrooms.
Max, how does the term an imperfect leader resonate with you?
Really well. When we were both in San Antonio for the AASA National Conference, and when I was looking through the brochure before I met you, I actually saw the session that you were doing. And as I immediately saw that, I'm like, that's a session for me. And it just struck me. I don't know if you coined the phrase or not, but it really speaks to who I am as a leader. And I'm sure lots of my colleagues can attest to that. And this idea that if we can just embrace our own imperfection and the fact that we're never quite there, we're more likely to make more progress towards wherever it is we're leading and how we're trying to grow. So it really resonated.
And we'll be right back. An Imperfect Leader is underwritten in part by the Waters Center for Systems Thinking. Founded by Jim and Faith Waters, the Waters Center for Systems Thinking is an organization dedicated to helping individuals and institutions design systems to help them make more thoughtful decisions. Check out the Waters Center for Systems Thinking at their website, waterscenterst.org. An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action is supported by ILAA, a firm dedicated to supporting aspiring new and established leaders. For more information, please find them at human-centeredleaders.com. I am so excited. My new book, An Imperfect Leader, Human-Centered Leadership in After Action, is now available. You can order it by going to Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I've seen it online in lots of bookstores. Thank you so much for your support. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest today is Max Silverman, and Max is the Executive Director of the University of Washington's Center for Educational Leadership, also known as CEL. In this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they had to make, and then we discuss it. So, Max, what happened?
Yeah, I was a high school principal, and I was leading a conversion of a comprehensive high school to 3 small schools. And at the time we were doing this, there was a lot of the Gates Foundation was investing heavily in small schools, and small schools was sort of the rage across the country. And pretty quickly, people were seeing that like new startup small schools had advantages. So the pilot schools in Boston and the small schools in New York City had certain advantages in that they were able to create the cultures that they wanted for their students and school community. The opposite was happening on what they call conversion campuses. That's sort of the status quo, the culture of the comprehensive high school in all sorts of ways, whether it was the sports programs, the music programs, the math department wanting to stay together across small schools as a math department, really was getting in the way of these schools getting off the ground. And so we were far enough out in terms of there was enough like evidence and examples of these conversions and what was causing them not to work, that we really understood that small school autonomy was critical to success. So and then there's a number of decisions that have to be made to create this autonomy. I won't get into all of those decisions, but the one that I would like to share with you was a decision that, as the outgoing principal, I still had some say over what was going to happen in the autonomous schools. And one thing we learned was the old principal has to go, because that person was one of the people that sort of kept the old culture going.
They represented status quo. Got it.
Yes. So on the way out, I, wanted to use my position to help the new principals get some things in place. And one thing we all deeply believed, and, I might have been the most adamant, was that to foster autonomy, schools should be able to set their own schedules And that's the decision that I made that really I still think about many, many years later.
So we're going to get into that a little bit here. One of the pieces that, for those who are listening, a conversion into 3 is meaning that you have a large comprehensive high school and you're going to break it into 3 distinct schools within that same building. So students will be assigned to one of 3 buildings. And I'm familiar with it from my time in Oakland, California. We saw that happening at Oakland Tech, at Fremont. So we saw school within a school kind of models.
Castlemont
is a good
Yeah,
example.
we studied Oakland very closely.
Yeah, I'm sure there were a lot of lessons learned.
Yeah,
Those in my doctoral program who were doing it and leading in that were lamenting, or what seemed to be celebratory initially was, wow, there is a lot going on here. So
there were some really brilliant people trying to figure out how to do right by kids, and it was
that's exactly
complex.
right. Yeah. So as you're looking back, what got overlooked?
Yeah. So what worked was that, along with some other moves, it really did allow these small schools to quickly build cultures. What was overlooked was this was, to begin with, a smaller comprehensive high school, maybe about 1,200 students. So now you're talking about small schools of about 300 students. And what got overlooked was getting students access to both upper level classes, so like AP classes that the small schools couldn't afford to offer on their own. Getting them access to, there was an really beautiful regional occupational skill center that ran on a certain schedule. So getting students access to that, and also getting access to arts and music.
So I'm thinking about this from this aspect of kids losing out on certain opportunities in terms of the curricular courses or co-curricular courses that may be the reason why kids actually come to school. And typically the next question is, what did you learn about relationships? So let me just ask you, what did you learn about relationships?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think what happened initially was some real fracturing of relationships. And I have to say, like, these schools got off the ground really powerfully. And the bet was that the relationships and personalization is what would sort of, like, that's the thing that kids yearn for and would drive. And in many ways, that proved successful. And some of the small schools figured out solutions. Like, one of them just offered AP Lit to all students in the school. And so some things were figured out, but relationships were fractured in many ways, both because some people's vested interests in different programming. They were either offended, insulted, or lost access to students who drove resources. So some, and others, people really strongly felt that access to these programs were really critical, and saw the decision that I made and supported as really disconnecting kids from important things. So I think the first thing that happened was some fracturing, and then actually a little bit of a bunker mentality. Like, oh, these people don't understand what we're trying to do. And they became obstacles.
Oh, those unintended, or what do we call them? Accidental adversaries, right? Everybody's working towards a common purpose, but then become adversaries because there's this sort of causal loop within that work.
Yes.
What frustrated you?
I think, we were on our learning edge. And I think what was frustrating was, I mentioned before we started recording, this idea of that I learned from a mentor of mine, Rick Lear, who tells me he didn't get it's not from him. I don't know who he got it from. This idea of going far enough, fast enough to break the gravitational pull of the status quo. And I think what was frustrating was still doing that in a school system that, for good reason, felt a lot of responsibility to ensure that certain things were happening. So, like pressures around maintaining school sports, that I think the school board and superintendent legitimately felt were important. So I think what was frustrating was, like, going to the East Coast and seeing these truly autonomous schools and not knowing how to really fully create that autonomy within the funding structure and district structure in place.
My mentor uses the phrase, when you agitate for change, the system will work aggressively to return to stasis. And so I like
Yes.
complementing that phrase with what you have suggested in terms of how to break through that gravitational
Yeah.
pull. And yet you didn't totally have the autonomy to choose where you were going. You were being pulled into an orbit that you had no control over. And so that's kind of an interesting autonomy, but not autonomy to some extent.
Yes.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, but
Um,
I'm gonna get the name of the book wrong, but it's like Orbiting the Giant Hairball, I think. Are you familiar with that book?
no. And if that's the title, that is that's a wild one.
It's a wonderful book, and I won't be able to find the author right now, but it's by a guy who worked at Hallmark Cards and figured out, and for him, the hairball was the sort of bureaucracy of Hallmark Cards that was really harming Hallmark Cards because it wasn't allowing for the creativity needed to design new card brands and things like that. But he sort of figured out a way to stay in the, like, be outside the hairball, but in the orbit, and ended up in roles that allowed him really to add value, like design new. He still understood what Hallmark was trying to do and sort of what their boundaries were. So he was able to design some new greeting card lines for them that still, was close enough to the Hallmark sort of branding, but brought in new markets to them. But I love that idea. And that's what I struggled to do. That's what was frustrating.
I was going to
How
ask,
to
so
stay in that orbit around the giant hairball.
yeah, that's interesting. The last question before I ask, and in the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience is one that I sometimes don't ask leaders, but I'm going to ask you because I think it's important, because it's what got overlooked is certainly important from the system level, what frustrated you individually, and then certainly individually as well. If you could look back, what could you have done differently? Is there, as you have now, obviously this is something that's been on your mind for 20 years, and it's a great lesson for any leader who's thinking about change, particularly those who are working to change within a system that has some other established, that cultural field that is serving as that orbit.
Yeah. Part of my understanding of imperfection is not really going back and sort of delving too much into what I could have done differently, because and I think that's important for leaders to really
Well, you
realize,
get
like,
mired in and then you become somewhat paralyzed about making and attempting other changes down the road. Sure.
yeah. So I think one thing when I look back on this episode of leadership, I really the thing I've learned the most from it is I did way too much internalizing. I came to a solution and I internalized it, as imperfect leaders do, and just got into a defensive sort of protecting my point of view mode. And I missed a lot. I really missed a lot while I was doing that.
In the end, what was something that was good that came out of this experience?
I think some really beautiful things happened for teachers and students in those schools, and they figured out a lot of things. One of the schools, Odyssey, the essential school, created, I mentioned earlier, an intercession, and it was so beautiful to see, like, twice a year. I don't know if it was for 2 or 3 weeks. They shut down school so that kids could get elective credit, and either the teachers and or students designed electives. And it was really beautiful to see, like, teachers who were interested in biking, like taking kids on bike rides for 2 or 3 weeks, teachers interested in dance, teaching dance or photography, and students getting to learn so differently and learn about their teachers and their peers so differently.
Yeah, what a beautiful way of thinking about how to create what are teachers passionate about. So now they're fully in, and what are
Yes.
children interested in learning. And for those who are maybe driving and thinking, how might I do that in my middle school, for example? Think about how advisories are defined, because they're pretty lenient about what you do in advisory. And if you were to start with what are teachers excited about, and then allowing students to sign up for an advisory course that's actually mural painting, some amazing things can happen within your own building. And also just watch how discipline improves, attendance improves, particularly if you're doing it at some ridiculous hour in the morning, at 7:30 in the morning, when children are often late to school. They never miss mural painting or
Yes.
or woodworking or the kinds of things that typically require some type of certification, but under the umbrella of advisory can be done.
Yeah, there were some of the most beautiful moments I observed. And again, I was out of these schools by then. They were led by 3 great leaders and wonderful teachers. Some of the most powerful moments in education I've seen were in those small schools, with the level of student agency and ownership and teacher, agency and ownership.
What advice would you give to an aspiring leader?
What's so interesting to me is, now that I look back, I guess, I don't know if this is advice or things I've learned. One is, and this is not my term, I get this from Ed Catmull, who wrote Creativity Inc. He was one of the founders of Pixar, to see the unseen. And in my, anecdote, I didn't see the unseen. And to really seek out what might be going on that you don't know or understand. I've also really lately, my colleague Casey Lan at Cell really brings forth this idea of moving at the speed of trust. And I think that comes from Stephen Covey originally, and Adrienne Maury Brown really in Emergent Strategy brings that sort of sentiment forward. But, any place worth going is worth going together. And you can only go together if there's trust. And I guess this is actually our good friend Joe Davis reminded me of this the other days. You can't make other people happy, so don't try. Happiness and joy are intrinsic. So I think those 3 things really are what's resonating with me right now. And I wish when I was an aspiring leader, I was, better able to let my ego take a back seat and let some of these other ideas really, pull my leadership forward.
My guest again was Max Silverman. Max is the Executive Director of the University of Washington's Center for Educational Leadership. Max, this has been a real treat. I mean, Cell is playing a significant role in helping school districts reflect on their pasts as they build better futures. And having you join the podcast and hearing of the ways that school and district leaders can agitate for change, well, it's pretty inspiring. Thank you again for being my guest.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. We've only had 2 extending conversations in our lifetime so far, and I've really, really enjoyed both of them and looking forward to more.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created the Daruma doll butterfly artwork. Imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It is a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. And I'm proud to be an imperfect leader, so I hope you'll join me next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, Leadership in After Action.